Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment. And we welcome you to this very important hearing. And it's important just because of the symbolic nature of today, because with March Madness about to begin, it is important that we keep in mind the need for a level playing field. As we work to get more players in the clean energy game, including wind and solar and new clean tech companies, we cannot afford to simultaneously tilt the playing field against American businesses and manufacturers. This hearing will explore ways to keep all countries economically in bounds in the global challenge to reduce global warming pollution. Global warming does not recognize national borders. CO2 emitted in California has the same warming effect as CO2 emitted in China, Europe, or India. Rising sea levels threaten millions of people across the globe in places as far apart as Bangladesh, Boston, and Shanghai. Global warming highlights that we are, in fact, one world. And just as we are connected environmentally, so too are we connected economically. The actions we take in the United States to curb global warming pollution and create jobs cannot stand alone. A cement factory that emits heat-trapping emissions in the U.S. and then decides to move to Mexico or China in response to our laws would have accomplished nothing to reduce global warming, except perhaps to export jobs and emissions overseas. Thus, in a global economy, we cannot ignore the reality of global emissions, nor the reality of global competition. The subcommittee will hear today about some innovative proposals to address this problem, which is important but manageable. Once you drill down on the facts, it's clear that a relatively small number of industry sectors are highly energy intensive and directly vulnerable to international competition and the effects of that, which are brought about by carbon limits. Those industry sectors include iron, steel, aluminum, cement, glass, paper, and pulp, and basic chemicals. These sectors face international competition and have energy or carbon-intensive production processes. While it is true that these sectors together account for more than half of all CO2 from the manufacturing sector, their overall percentage is modest. The big six energy-intensive industries account for only about 6% of total U.S. emissions. These important industrial sectors, interestingly, constituted a little more than 3% of America's gross domestic output in 2005 and accounted for less than 2% of our jobs. To avoid shipping jobs or emissions overseas, some have suggested requiring that energy-intensive products imported into the United States be accompanied by some kind of fee or surcharge unless the product comes from a country with carbon pollution limits. This approach would put imported carbon-intensive products on the same footing as American-made goods and thus level the playing field. Mr. Marty McBroom of the American Electric Power is here to discuss the tariff allowance proposal his company co-authored with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Another way of dealing with potential competitive effects would be to take some of the allowance values from the carbon market and give them to the trade-exposed industry sectors to aid in their transition to a low-carbon economy. I commend the work of Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee, who have authored such an approach. Mr. Jack McLachlan, who represents a coalition of energy-intensive manufacturers who favor such an approach, is here to provide his views regarding that strategy. Finally, we should remember that in order to stop global warming, it will be necessary for virtually all countries, particularly industrialized countries, to limit their emissions of carbon pollution. If we are ultimately successful in halting global warming, the playing field will not remain tilted forever. And the best approach for keeping all countries in bounds is to encourage them to permanently match the U.S. by limiting emissions immediately. Only then will it be truly possible for teams and companies from places like China and India or Australia to compete without restrictions on the same court as teams from places like North Carolina or Boston College or the University of Illinois or Michigan State or Pittsburgh or Wisconsin or Texas A&M or Cal Berkeley or the University of Illinois at downstate at Champaign.
Don't forget Penn State won in overtime last night in NIT.
Penn State's in the NIT. Yeah. The University of Pittsburgh is doing well, however, and again, dare I say it, the University of Michigan. So I look forward to all of our witnesses' testimony here today, and that completes time for the opening statement of the chair. We turn and recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to putting my bracket up against yours, so you better get yours done tonight.
You don't happen to pick all Jesuit schools to go all the way, do you? That's never been a winning strategy for me, but I can't break my habit of doing that. So,
glad you pick with your heart, not your head.
Not a good strategy.
Thank you again for having this hearing. I want to appreciate testimony from our witnesses that I looked at last night. But before I begin, I'd like to submit a letter that was submitted to our committee last year from former U.S. Trade Rep Susan Schwab. She wrote that we have serious concerns, particularly the enthusiasm for using import provisions that might be perceived as unilateral trade restrictions directed against other countries to push them to move rapidly to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. This approach will take us down a dangerous path and adversely affect U.S. manufacturing, farmers, and consumers, and even cause an all-out trade war where no one wins and everyone loses. History has shown that the U.S. is stronger with a robust manufacturing and industrial base. The jobs and industries that will bear the greatest costs of climate legislation are the same industries that we need to keep in America in order to remain a power on the world stage. These are the jobs that built the middle class, and since 2000, U.S. manufacturing has been struggling. From 2000 to 2008, we lost 3.8 million manufacturing jobs, a decline of about 22%. And at the same time, imports were up 29%, a direct correlation. And my home state of Michigan has been ground zero for these losses. The manufacturing and energy-intensive industrial sectors are highly competitive. More often than not, the cost of energy is the difference between operating in the U.S. and shutting the doors to move overseas. And what happens to our national security when we don't manufacture anything? Well, what happens when we need to order all of our steel and aluminum from China? If we take the wrong legislative path dealing with climate change, we run the real risk of permanently destroying our manufacturing and defense supply chains. And in times of crisis, we will be helpless at the mercy of others. The days of Rosie the Riveter and an entire generation coming together to rebuild our military from the ground up will only be a distant memory. By design, a cap-and-trade scheme works by adding to the cost of energy, and through that, an increase in production costs for energy-intensive industries and manufacturing. There are cost containment mechanisms that will be discussed this morning that may help mitigate some of the increases, but at the end of the day, they won't be enough to save the jobs. And when factories move overseas, the environment is worse for it. Let's take steel. In the U.S., steel producers are the most efficient in the world. On average, American steel makers emit 1.2 tons of greenhouse gases per ton of steel. Compare that to Chinese steel emissions, estimated to be in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 tons of greenhouse gases emitted for each ton of steel that they make. We're not helping the environment by sending industries that operate cleanly and efficiently in the U.S. to a regulation-free China. China is the #1 emitter in the world, with greenhouse gas growth every year that equals the current output of Germany. We shouldn't be tying a hand behind our back. We can reduce emissions and create jobs through other policies, and now is not the time for a costly cap-and-trade system. Closing, I'd like to put the scale of the emissions reductions being called for in these bills a little bit in perspective. These proposals would mean that the U.S. cannot emit more in the year 2050 than we emitted in 1910. That's a pretty daunting task, considering that in 1910, the U.S. only had 92 million people, compared to an estimated 420 million that we'll have in 2050, and a per capita income in current dollars of about $6,000. To reach that lofty goal of 80% reduction, emissions from the entire transportation sector would have to drop to zero. Emissions from all electricity generation would have to drop to zero. Then we'd need to reduce the remainder by about 50%. Think about the industries and jobs that we'd have to lose to meet those goals. Can we really succeed as a power on the world stage if we shed these industries? Can our economy recover without those jobs? My guess is that most of us know the answers. Yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. It is an important one. As I have said before, you are to be commended for building a strong record as we continue to move towards comprehensive climate change legislation. I'd like to be clear. The U.S. is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and we're also the lone superpower. We must also be a leader. That said, we need to make strong action corresponding to ours by developing countries and others if we're to go forward on this. We need this for three reasons. First, without compensating action from developing countries, we simply will not get the reductions that the vast majority of scientists agree we need to achieve to avoid devastating effects of climate change. And I would note that the Senate has already acted on this under the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which passed 95-0, setting out the strong feelings of the Senate on this particular matter. Without corresponding action by developing countries with whom we compete internationally, the relative cost of American goods and services could increase and could cause U.S. industry and jobs to migrate to nations that do not limit their emissions. And I can tell you from discussions with the Chinese and others that this is a very real danger, especially based upon the concerns that I expressed to the Chinese in the meeting at Kyoto. Three, past debate on climate change suggests that the Congress would be unlikely to adopt legislation committing the U.S. to limiting its greenhouse gas emissions in absence of assurances that developing countries will take similar action. And I would note again the Byrd-Hagel resolution that passed the Senate 95-0 on this point. There are two options to ensure mandated reductions in the U.S. will not cause jobs and the emissions associated with them to move to countries with less stringent controls. First, free emission allocation to entities that produce goods sold internationally in internationally competitive marketplaces and whose competitiveness would be sorely affected by a domestic cap-and-trade program. Second is a program of border adjustments, which is commonly referred to as the IBEW approach, which you referred to in your comments. Under this proposal, we would require, through tariffs, border taxes, or other mechanisms, the prices of relevant imported goods to reflect the same price that is included in competing U.S. goods as a result of domestic climate change legislation. Again, you referred to this, and I believe it is an essential part of any legislation which this committee or other committees can and should move forward. I would note that the draft that Representative Boucher and I released last year contains a combination of these two approaches. And it is to be noted that that draft carries the proposals which were made and endorsed and approved by an organization of industry and environmentalists. I would urge my colleagues to take a look at this draft as a reference point. It is critical that whatever approach the committee decides to take, it must be in a manner that is reasonably certain to withstand a challenge before the World Trade Organization, which realistically we must expect to be filed. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the two proposals and their WTO compliance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A theory is a coherent group of general propositions used as principles of explanation for a class of phenomenon. We unequivocally state, mostly on my colleague's side, that global warming is a fact. It is still a theory, and I'd like to submit for a record a story yesterday from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the headline is University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee study could realign climate change debate. And part of it, what I have highlighted is scientists said that the air and ocean systems of the Earth are now showing signs of synchronization with each other. Eventually the systems begin to couple and the synchronous state destroyed, leading to a climate shift in climate. When this happens, the climate state changes. You go from a cooling regime to a warming regime, or a warming regime to a cooling regime. This way we are able to explain all the functions in the global temperature trend in the past century. The research team has found the warming trend of the past 30 years has stopped. Okay, these are scientists now. The research team has found the warming trend of the past 30 years has stopped, and in fact, global temperatures have leveled off since 2001. Now, I say that to start with the debate of is there a tourney at all and should there be games played. I'm not convinced that there is. The chairman is correct in that cement factories will move. I've already been told that. Iron, steel, manufacturing, it's not the climate provisions, it is the energy costs that will cause them to move. A study of the Warner-Lieberman, 1 million jobs lost without carbon, 3 million with carbon. This hearing is avoiding leakage. That's cute for saying jobs will be lost, and I yield back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very critical hearing. I believe the concerns with job and emissions leakage as well as international competitiveness will be one of the key issues we need to address if we're going to be able to successfully pass a climate bill this session. As many of you know, Jay Inslee and I have been working over the past 18 months to put together a comprehensive policy to address this critical question. Our policy, which essentially will pay for the additional cost the bill imposes on these industries, using funds generated through a cap-and-trade program, will go a long way towards addressing the concerns of a specific group of high carbon-intensive industries who have an internationally set price for their product. It should be noted that the European Union has identified similar industries within their Phase 3 cap-and-trade program. The industries we believe should qualify would include steel, cement, aluminum, along with a few others. Our policy, however, Mr. Chairman, will not address every single concern these industries face, and other policies will be needed to complement it. For example, we do not directly seek to address the possibility of a rising cost of natural gas, and other policies within the overall cap-and-trade bill will be necessary to address this very real concern. With that said, though, I believe that our policy is the most comprehensive one yet proposed and look forward to having it included as a baseline provision in the draft bill you are expected to release by the end of the month. Some specific questions do remain as this policy evolves and is integrated into the overall bill. We are limited at this time by a lack of necessary data, but hope that the greenhouse gas registry that EPA is developing will be able to guide this policy in the future. I look forward to working closely with you, Mr. Chairman, as we seek to answer these remaining questions. Although this issue is extremely complicated, our proposal will go a long way towards answering many of the industry's legitimate concerns. And with that, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening today's hearing. In a time of economic crisis, it is critical that American jobs are not lost due to an overly burdensome cap-and-trade bill. However, after looking at several studies on how cap-and-trade will affect employment, I have a hard time understanding how what amounts to $1 big tax increase won't lead to even more job losses. An EPA analysis illustrates that even less stringent emission-cutting measures than the President's budget will reduce manufacturing jobs by up to 12%. This means 3 to 4 million people will lose employment. A CBO study says that, quote, investors might see the value of their stocks decline and workers could face higher risk of unemployment as jobs in those sectors were cut, end quote. Even if large and high-energy intensive industries are given emissions allowances, small business will still be hit very hard as they will have to shoulder the burden of high gasoline and energy prices and higher-priced goods. MIT researchers predict that a family's energy bill will increase by $3,128 per year. So not only would Americans lose their jobs, they would be forced to pay much higher household energy bills because of legislation proposed. President Obama acknowledged this in a meeting with the editorial board of the San Francisco Chronicle in January of 2008, when he said, quote, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers, end quote. Mr. Chairman, we need to carefully consider the negative impact of an overly burdensome cap-and-trade bill that it will have on our economy. And in today's economy, I do not believe it's in the best interest of American families to pass a bill that will cost jobs, raise energy costs, and make their way of life harder and more challenging. I look forward to hearing today's witnesses and yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. I'm sorry, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for continuing to tackle this issue and examining the details of how we need to construct an effective and strong climate change plan. As I've said before in this room, Sacramento is seeing the effects of climate change every day, from less snowpack to increased wildfires to water shortages. My constituents who are at the mercy of the Sacramento and American rivers are truly afraid of what will happen if we do not act. However, Sacramento's unemployment is over 10%. I do not need to tell anyone here what more job losses would do. So as we craft this bill, I want to ensure that we incorporate appropriate policy measures that enhance American industry and vitality. The witnesses will be laying out a number of policy options today that I want to further explore as we craft this bill. However, we need to go more in depth on the exact formula for the upcoming legislation. We need to get this right. That is why we want to hear from you, our witnesses, on specifics of what this country needs to do. If we give allocations to carbon-intensive manufacturers, we need to ensure that we do not simply gut our efforts to clean this planet. If we incorporate tax breaks, we need to ensure that they are targeted enough so that companies in need receive help, but also defined in scope so we begin to move to a cleaner economy as a whole. And if we pursue international agreements and border duties, I want to ensure that we fully understand WTO trade implications. Some say the devil is in the details, yet I think a better future is in the details. I just want to make sure we get this right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We look forward to this hearing and certainly welcome our witnesses today. Yesterday, AP had a story, U.S.-China worlds apart on climate change curbs. And the director of China's climate change office said that China did not want to be held accountable for emissions that it produces to make goods for export. He went on to say that if the U.S. tried to impose tariffs on imports from China or other countries that didn't have mandatory emission controls, that would be unfair and a violation of trade rules and would start a serious trade war. So as we move forward, all of us are very much concerned about the impact on employment and our competitiveness with other countries. So I look forward to these witnesses and yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to waive my time but ask unanimous consent to place my statement and also a letter from the American Chemistry Council into the record.
Great. Gentleman may do that. Chair recognizes the Gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I just consider myself a ditto head for Mike Doyle, so I want to associate myself for his brilliant comments about this amendment we're working on. We've proposed one approach to this, and I just want to note a couple of advantages that of Mike and I's approach that I want to comment on. First, it's clear that we do need to address this issue, and just ignoring it is not a solution. So number one, we've got a proposal addressing it. Two, our proposal is an output-based allocation of these allowances, and I think that's might seem a little technical, but an extremely important part of our proposal, because when you do an output-based allocation, it essentially is an incentive for efficiency. And it gives an incentive for our industry to move to more efficient processes and infrastructure, which will become a great competitive advantage in international competition over the long term. So the way we've structured this, it gives a reason for American industry to become more competitive over time so that we can win those jobs over the long term in international competition. Second, this approach is something we can do now without the necessity of risking trade wars right now. That's something that we always have the option of doing with trade adjustment at the border. We can do this now in a way that I think the testimony today will demonstrate can be helpful to our industries both in the import issue and in the export issue, because our approach will help both in the import and export side of the competitive international markets. Third, we think we're heading in the right direction in figuring out and defining the industries that will be assisted by this. And we're going to continue to work with some of the witnesses and the rest of the stakeholders to define that, but we think we've got a fairly rational way of doing that. So we'll look forward to the testimony today. We have some more work to do and look forward to making the right decisions. Thanks.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I find that this kind of hearing is vitally important for the people of America to understand the implications of the policies we're currently considering. I think everyone understands that the goal of reducing greenhouse gases is well intended, and it is believed that a cap and trade mechanism is one mechanism to get there and worthy of pursuit. The sad thing is that too many people don't understand exactly how that will be applied here in the nation and what consequences it will have. I recently was having dinner with a friend of mine who is deeply involved in the trucking business, and the President's budget had already come out in which he had made it clear that whatever cap and trade system he imposed, he wanted to have a 100% auction of the initial credits. My friend from the trucking industry did not understand that concept and believed that the initial distribution of the credits was going to be based on historical use, as has been discussed here, and that there would not be an actual auction. I think these are very, very important questions to be discussed and answered here and to be communicated to the American people. If, in fact, the President's proposal that we auction every single initial credit to those industries that need them in order to remain in business, then there will be a vast cost imposed by this program across the economy. Many of my colleagues on the Republican side are calling this a tax. Unfortunately, that may cause some confusion amongst the public because it isn't technically a tax. It's not an additional charge where the money flows directly to the government. However, it is the sale of a new commodity that the government is going to create where the revenues come to the government. And the people need to understand that and need to understand that it will impact literally everything they do, from turning on the lights in their home to the price of a suit to the cost of a sandwich. And whenever this Congress proposes to enact new policies, we need to both make clear the goal those policies intend to address and also the consequences of those policies. I think that the American people deserve to know precisely what the cost of this policy will achieve and also what danger it will alleviate or purportedly alleviate before we impose, particularly on a down economy, a new policy of this size, which could have vast consequences across the entire economic structure. So I thank the chairman for holding the hearing.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that you're holding this hearing because it's an important issue. I think global warming has a tremendous potential for us to become more efficient, for us to create new industries and new jobs, but there's downsides or potential downsides. As my colleague right here next to me mentioned, I have unemployment as high as 18% in parts of my district, so losing jobs is the last thing that I want to see happen. And I think if we look at Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee's proposal carefully, look at all these things carefully, we can come up with a good policy that will protect American jobs and accomplish the critical goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time create a whole new sector of jobs. So let's look at this with an open mind. I certainly look forward to seeing what the committee is going to say after having read their testimony, and with that I yield back to the committee.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With unanimous consent, I'll place a statement in the record.
Great. Chair recognizes without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive an opening statement. And I'm sorry.
Mr. Scalise.
Forgot we got two from Louisiana now.
I'll speak for both of us if it'll be your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and want to thank the witnesses for also appearing before our subcommittee. Serious issues surround global climate change policy, issues that spread throughout our country and touch every American family. Efforts to tax carbon emissions could cause serious, possibly irreparable harm to our national economy, not to mention that our country's efforts could be in vain if other countries like China and India do not follow a similar strategy. A strong economy includes a strong energy sector, and this subcommittee must be very careful not to pass an energy tax that will have a negative immediate and long-term effect on the health of our national economy while adding more than $1,300 to every American family's energy bill. The dislocation of American businesses and American jobs is a strong possibility if Congress passes legislation that will make it unrealistic and economically unfeasible to remain in our country. Some estimates reach as high as 7 million jobs lost in America if we pass a cap-and-trade tax, as was proposed in the 110th Congress. Add to that the fact that some geographical regions of our country will suffer disproportionate and devastating economic losses if such legislation were to become law. In addition, to take certain forms of clean, renewable sources of energy like nuclear off the table for consideration only adds insult to injury. As I've reiterated in past hearings, it is imperative that we consider these realities as we consider these policies. Instead of Washington bureaucrats mandating harmful policies that will kill key sectors of our national economy, we should instead explore policies that encourage investment in cleaner technology and innovation in the private sector. The ingenuity of the American entrepreneurial spirit is what has made our country the best in the world, and this Congress would be wise to encourage more of that entrepreneurial spirit rather than running off with harmful energy tax policies, that same spirit. The effect of a cap-and-trade tax are broader in scope than some in this Congress want to admit to the American people. Such legislation will ship American jobs overseas, will make heating and cooling our homes much more expensive, and will increase the cost of everyday household products. I would urge caution as we proceed with a cap-and-trade plan and make sure that we fully explore these adverse effects that such a policy would have on American jobs and American families. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation is a lone superpower in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. With this stature comes the unique responsibility to set an example, to model behaviors that we want other nations to emulate. It is true that emissions are rising fastest in developing countries. China's emissions are projected to continue rising rapidly, up 71% by 2020. India is in a similar situation, with emissions projected to continue rising up to 68% in that very same time frame. But we cannot use the behavior of developing nations as an excuse for our inaction. Rather, we must demonstrate by our own example that it is possible to rise to the challenge of creating efficient, effective, and environmentally friendly climate change programs, which in turn will create jobs in a new green economy. However, we have a responsibility to our nation, our businesses, our workers, our consumers, our constituents, to ensure that American industries remain competitive, that American jobs and the production of products remain right here in this country, and that prices and costs remain reasonable and affordable. In Wisconsin, our many energy-intensive manufacturers face tough international competition, particularly from businesses located in countries that have not committed to regulating emissions. To ensure that we do not unjustifiably disadvantage our domestic manufacturing base, we must examine ways to minimize the costs of cap-and-trade compliance and do everything that we can to prevent the loss of U.S. jobs to less or unregulated countries. I recognize this issue is complex, but there are policy options for mitigating potential competitiveness impacts and encouraging developing countries to curb their greenhouse gas emissions. And I look forward to this challenge. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome our witnesses.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're hearing on this side that we're going to lose jobs when we hear the gentlelady just talking about this is going to create jobs. So I think we got a disconnect here, Mr. Chairman. Maybe you can be the referee here, but when we look at some of the, for example, the National Association of Manufacturers, they estimate that a cap-and-trade scheme will cost up to 4 million jobs. The Heritage Foundation, who estimates the loss of up to 5.3 million jobs, or the Charles River Associates estimate that the job loss could be as high as 7 million. So there seems to be a consensus on our side, we're going to lose jobs, and yet you indicate we're going to gain jobs. Now, Mr. Whitfield, in his opening statement, pointed out what China said. China does not want to become a low-carbon society. In fact, they don't want to have any kind of this cap-and-trade part of their export process. And their individual who is the director of China's climate change office said it would be a disaster and possibly the start of a trade war for the U.S. to impose tariffs on imports from China and other countries that didn't have mandatory emission control. So I asked the gentlelady, in light of all the statistics and the groups that I see here, in light of what China said, it's hard to believe that this cap-and-trade is going to create more jobs. In fact, it appears to be, the consensus is, an industry where the jobs are created, it's going to lose jobs. The massive new regulatory burdens imposed by a cap-and-trade will inevitably undercut the growth and innovation we desperately need to build lasting and effective solutions, fostering technology and scientific research, not capping the economy and trading U.S. jobs, will obviously guard our security, increase our energy independence. And so, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the witnesses, and I just think there is another way to go. Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Melanson. Gentleman from Louisiana.
See, you tried to catch me twice. I'm going to waive my opening statement.
Great. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. Okay, the chair sees the gentleman from Oregon. I'm sorry. Chair sees the gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Barton, and recognizes him for an opening statement.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the opportunity to have another dialogue today about climate change. In a global economy where any producer is just an airplane ride away from any customer and boundaries don't seem to matter, the United States does need a competitive edge Our edge is individual creativity, freedom, an educated and dedicated workforce, and an energy policy, at least until now, based on free markets and supply and demand and least cost. Unfortunately, we have an unemployment rate that's going up, not down. It just hit 8.1%. And it appears that there is a congressional majority determined to adopt a carbon cap and trade policy that is absolutely the worst thing we could be doing right now to protect the jobs that we still have in our economy. We can debate the ins and outs all we want, but if you really want to stop job leakage, don't do cap and trade. It's that simple. We cannot escape the unassailable truth that if you're trying to cap carbon, which is one of the most ubiquitous elements in the world, it's going to put a price on it. It's going to go up, and if the price causes it to go up, jobs are going to go down. It's that simple. Manufacturers compete globally. The cost of energy has a bearing. Whether we manufacture or create that energy, produce that energy in the United States or in China, Mexico, or Brazil. If consumers can just as easily import steel, concrete, and other energy-intensive goods from our competitors, then American producers won't be able to add the cost of greenhouse gas permits to their bills without losing that competitive edge. Everyone knows what happens next. Declining revenues push companies to close facilities in the United States and cut American jobs. I have a factory in my district in my small hometown of Ennis, Texas, about 15,000 people, that has been there for 60 years. They announced 2 weeks ago they're closing the factory and moving it to China. They make mattress box springs. They've been doing it for 60 years in Ennis, Texas. But sometime next year, they're going to start doing it somewhere in China. We are naive if we think that China and India and other emerging industrialized countries will sacrifice their own growing economies and their own jobs in response to a theory that has yet to be proven. It just won't work. So, I look forward to this hearing. I know most of the witnesses on a personal basis. They're all good people. And I'm sure we're going to have a good dialogue, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Yeah. Great. And the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walton, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch on two topics this morning. Before I get into my views on on the cap and trade proposal, I'd just like to draw to your attention and that of the committees that apparently in the stimulus bill, there was a provision I think a lot of people supported to encourage people to install new energy-efficient windows and get a tax credit for it. The House passed a version that was logical, reasonable. Senate did as well, but somewhere in conference, new standards got put in place that's been brought to my attention would make the cost of these windows exceed any logical ability for anybody to make a decision to go get them, which negates the whole idea of energy efficiency and stimulative effect. And I draw that to your attention, Mr. Chairman, because I hope we can look into this problem and correct it. Apparently, this was something parachuted in conference that sets such a high standard that instead of a $400 or $500 window, it would be a $1,500 window. And so people aren't going to take advantage of either the incentive or the energy reduction. And so I draw that to your attention, and I would hope we could find out how that happened and its impact. Regarding cap and trade, I'm deeply concerned about the $646 billion tax increase this represents. When a number of us on this side of the aisle met with industry leaders from U.S. CAP, I posed the question, if we create a cap and trade system that means higher energy costs, will you commit not to take your jobs to cheaper energy places that don't play by these rules? And not a single corporate executive would agree to that request. I think that's all that needed to be said on that point. It's very disturbing what it'll do to our economy at a time of great job loss, to increase taxes and to drive more jobs overseas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations for getting the television cameras back on. This is great. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for allowing us to have some time to talk about cap and trade and the effect that it may have on employment, and also the potential effect that we could have of moving more energy-intensive industries and jobs from America to countries with less stringent emission requirements. Saving jobs and creating new economic growth is something that I hope that we could accomplish at this committee. I don't think we can overlook the fact that these new jobs are likely to be at the expense of good jobs in energy-intensive industries or in small businesses that do not qualify for allocations or protection from higher energy costs. Taxing greenhouse gas-intensive imports will not be an effective way to limit job loss. Consider the impact of the United States' attempts to induce foreign countries into unfavorable trade agreements. It could possibly incite other trade difficulties or at least exchanges of harsh words over trade balance. Either way, our nation's global position and reliance on trade is too important to risk without a serious cost-benefit analysis, and to date I don't think I've seen one. Shifting import taxes upon countries of origin will only make American products more expensive. Companies are in business to make money. When the rest of the world develops, export-rich companies will simply sell wherever the best opportunity is for profit. If you're looking to sell a product, realistically, would you look toward a company that's in recession and stacking on excessive trade barriers and forcing industries to buy carbon credits to cover emission? It's not likely, especially when there are major emerging alternatives. In the end, globalization of trade markets is based upon getting around barriers such as taxes to lower production costs and ultimately the prices that consumers pay. If there's a way to get around taxes and continue to emit in order to achieve higher prices, I suspect people will find a way. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired.